receiving a call from her panicked sister on one of the most pivotal days in American history. Ring, ring. Hello? Where is our mother? As far as I know, she was boarding a plane this morning from Chicago to Washington, D.C. Why? What's happening? Gloria, turn your television on. On September 11th, 2001, 3 commercial American planes were hijacked by an Islamic terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, targeting the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in the D.C. area. Yet another federal building could have been destroyed if the 4th plane had not instead crashed into an open field in Pennsylvania. Realizing that the United States was under attack, the Federal Aviation Administration immediately shut down all airlines. One particular flight to D.C. had not yet left the ground in Chicago, so the passengers were swiftly unloaded, and my great-grandmother returned safely home on a shuttle bus. That was 20 years ago. Decades, plural, have passed, trying to protect America. We fight for our freedom, our faith, our family. If our military had not instantly responded, more terrorist attacks would have ensued, threatening the security of our faith, our freedom, and our families. If we pull out now, we will suffer that same fate. Yet only 3 weeks ago, which was more than 7 months after I chose the topic for this speech, presidential administration announced that all U.S. troops will be removed from Afghanistan by September 11th of this year on the 20-year anniversary. I believe that this course of action would be disastrous for America's homeland security. Without studying history or examining current policies and threats, people make judgments about why we should not be wasting lives, money, and supplies on a war that has lasted 20 years. So let us educate ourselves on our military engagements, see our role as the wealthiest global power, and recognize the responsibility that comes with possessing the #1 international military strength. Since the primary responsibility of the United States government is the welfare of its own people, America's proactive approach against foreign terrorism is a vital form of domestic protection. After the attacks on 9/11, U.S. President George W. Bush declared that we were engaged in a war against global terrorism that, quote, will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated, end quote. American troops immediately began deploying all over the Middle East, including Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, ready to stamp out any perceivable terrorist threats. Namely, a group called Al-Qaeda, who was sponsoring the fundamentalist political organization, the Taliban. Scholars describe terrorism as, quote, the sustained use or threat of use of violence by a small group for political purposes such as inspiring fear, drawing widespread attention to a political grievance, or provoking a draconian or unsustainable response, end quote. And Al-Qaeda was just that, except for that it is no longer a small group acting to attract attention, but a globally and internationally terrorist international work of affiliated extremist groups whose principal objective is to inflict mass casualties. Ultimately, the goal of Al-Qaeda involved replacement of all apostate regimes in the Middle East with true Islamic governments. But with Mr. Big Brother United States hanging over Al-Qaeda's proverbial shoulder and actively supporting Al-Qaeda's enemies, that goal was slow in coming. The United States was perceived to be the main inhibitor of Al-Qaeda's ambitions. Thus, the 9/11 planes flew into the World Trade Center as an issue of warning. Within a year after entering combat, however, America had assumed rapid victory. Taliban leader Mullah Omar fled after inexorable surrender, and the Al-Qaeda lost their puppets. But despite this official fall of the Taliban, cowardly Al-Qaeda leaders continued to hide in the mountains and civilian towns where direct military confrontation would be impossible. Therefore, U.S. troops have remained in Afghanistan ever since, knowing that the moment military presence withdraws from Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda will reemerge just as before. Although this protracted war has encompassed 20 years, and a total of 2,400 U.S. military deaths in Afghanistan have occurred, that seems almost negligible when compared to the hundreds of thousands of American lives lost in both World Wars and the Korean War. Nevertheless, we can agree that even one life is worth saving if withdrawing our men is appropriate for stability, finances, and time. But what I hope to prove to you throughout this speech is that U.S. stationing of troops in Afghanistan remains the wisest choice of action in order to protect our people from further threat. First, I will accentuate the fact that our primary responsibility is toward the protection of our own people, and that positive results will ensue from the promotion and stabilization of these international relations. Then, I will express how we have a moral obligation to the Afghan people, both as an influential global power and as Christians. Next, I will explain how withdrawal from Afghanistan would be wise, and finally, that we have a plan with the foreseeable future that will ensure Afghan involvement so they can eventually take responsibility for their own government. As Americans grounded in patriotism, we must show concern for the welfare of our citizens by eliminating the escalation of terrorist threats in Afghanistan. The saying, an ounce of prevention today is a pound of protection tomorrow, accurately indicates the figurative force field that is set in motion by proactive prevention. U.S. Major Kirk Dooley served 24 years in the Marine Corps, part of which was his deployment with the 1st and 2nd Raider Battalions to Afghanistan as executive officer and intelligence center director in special operations. After retiring with the Bronze Star, he returned home with first-hand information about American engagement in the Middle East and how the natives have reacted to our involvement. He shared with me that among Americans there is, quote, a lot of passion regarding this topic, on whether military engagement in Afghanistan is effective or worth it. But we must take into account the value of proactive and preemptive approaches to conflict before they come to our shores, end quote. My friend likes to call Americans Advil hoppers. She says we like to take the medication as relief to pain and problems rather than taking vitamins preventatively. If we can quickly determine our approach to a war, then proactive engagement ensures our level of control over the outcome. Preemptive attacks now ensure no nasty surprises later. This is also an opportunity to improve international relationships. Certain commodities, such as petroleum, natural gas, and phosphate, maintain global availability depending on secure relations. If we can manage to ensure friendly relations with Afghanistan by infiltrating their terrorist infestation, it will ensure security in trade as well. Hold out just a little bit longer, allow the military to finish their task, and the positive results will be worthwhile for all civilians involved, both Afghan and American. Now let's turn our focus to the Afghani as people. Our moral responsibility as a prospering nation to defend weaker international powers is to Afghanistan as a global country, which would have continued to suffer helplessly under Taliban regime without American assistance. By offering our advanced military resources and other advancements, we can, quote, improve security governance, institutions, and economy. This will strengthen Afghanistan's capabilities as a partner, as well as benefit their personal lives, end quote. Any person living in the Helmand province in Afghanistan has the same entitlements to safety and quality of life as someone living in Mason, Ohio. Remember, it is not Afghanistan we are at war with, but terrorism itself against which we fight. Not all Middle Easterners are terrorists. All people are endowed unalienable rights by God, being made in His image, and we must protect that with passion and intentionality. John MacArthur interprets the Bible's indication that, quote, God gives governments the responsibility of carrying out punishments on those who commit deadly atrocities, like those perpetrated on September 11th. He says that responsibility includes waging war when necessary against nations or groups that carry out such actions, end quote. How much more valuable are human lives than sheep or sparrows that when their cry against terror and oppression that are corporate in their everydays are overlooked? We have physical soldiers on Middle Eastern soil, but we also have invested millions in the welfare of citizens there, building schools, roads, and government infrastructure. According to a missionary currently in Afghanistan, quote, unless you came to Kabul and saw the thousands of little girls walking to and from school every day who would never have darkened those doors under the Taliban, you don't understand the impact we're having, end quote. Which invokes another question. What greater moral responsibility do we receive as Christians than that of sharing the gospel? This is an opportunity to share, perhaps for the first time, the message of salvation. According to missionaries stationed in the Middle East, quote, within a month after the September 11th terrorist strike, both U.S. forces and missionary forces were pouring into Afghanistan. In the natural, America was exacting revenge on a terrorist enemy. But in the spirit, God was again opening a new door for the gospel, using American and coalition military forces to hold it open. We fight not only against flesh and blood, but against all forces of evil. We fight against heretical ideology. We fight for the restoration of broken relationships. And we fight cancer. Terrorism is another form of evil, where Satan exploits human depravity to an almost incomprehensible extent. Therefore, just like other evils, we must be guarded and knowledgeable, taking action to put God's ways first and lead others in his plan for good. Unless we desire Afghanistan's retrogression, withdrawal would be unwise. So I will outline the advantages of waiting patiently for the military to reach its objectives. If the troops were to be extracted right now, the leftover Taliban members who have been hiding would attempt to seize power and try to reimpose that extremist theocracy. Afghan women as well, who have made gains, would again become servants to their male masters, not to mention the detriment brought upon those still in the country who collaborated with Americans while they were still there. New York Times journalist Mark Landler consults experts who are saying that, quote, a hasty American withdrawal would erode the authority and legitimacy of the Afghan government, raising the risk that the Taliban could recapture control of the country. Short of that, it could consign Afghanistan to a protracted, bloody civil war, with Taliban fighters besieging the capital, Kabul, like they did in the 1990s. If the U.S. abandons Afghanistan in its toddler phase of democracy, the orphan government might never mature into independence. Fear not, withdrawal will eventually occur, and our men will not forever remain in the Middle East. I'll cover that later in the speech. But for now, patience requires us to see the bigger picture. In January 2021, the Los Angeles Times wrote that, quote, until Washington has confidence that the terrorist risk has been routed or Homeland Security is impenetrable, removal of the counterterrorist mission would ill serve President-elect Joe Biden's ambition to promote the national self-interest. Yet here we are, and Biden wants to have our troops removed entirely by this fall. The one step forward, two steps back mantra may very well ensue if extraction occurs prematurely. So I beg our leadership to continue in our efforts for peace and security to heighten the likelihood of overall success. Next, I'd like to highlight the ways in which America has made progress up to this point. We aren't failing, and so withdrawal is unnecessary and hasty. President Bush warned us at its debut that, quote, this war will not be like the war against Iraq, with decisive liberation of territory and swift conclusion. It will not look like the war in the air above Kosovo, where no ground troops were used and not a single American was lost in combat. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign unlike any we have ever seen. It may include dramatic strikes visible on TV, or covert operations, secret even in success, end quote. Over the last 20 years in the Middle East, Americans have dedicated considerable amounts of time and effort to improving Afghanistan, but not just through military improvements, but also through societal and economic developments alongside the native people. Oftentimes, the media, says Christian missionary Howard Malone, will, quote, ensure you don't miss one image of blood and carnage from the latest suicide bombing in order to reinforce how they think that we're failing, end quote. The narrative presented on newscasts may be withholding certain perspectives, so I challenge you to recognize the genuine progress in our efforts. These liberal media outlets, says Malone, quote, won't show you the literally hundreds of new schools, hospitals, roads, public works, government infrastructure, and other projects our engineers and many NGOs have completed and are completing in Iraq and Afghanistan, end quote. First-hand accounts show the improvement made in Afghanistan. First-hand accounts testify to the robust military intelligence which is rooting out insurgents. First-hand accounts reveal the hope that is awakening in communities as threat levels relax. If we are allowing these accounts to rise to the surface, we'll be encouraged by even more reports of success. Can we then succumb to loss on pretenses of total failure? I think not. Finally, allow me to present a plan with a foreseeable future. People worry about a lack of direction in this campaign, and that is why the administration wants to pull out. If they had simply listened to the proposal presented in 2020, however, they would realize how unequivocally wrong this thinking is. The Secretary of Defense in 2019 and 2020, Mark Esper, set very specific goals for the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, which he expected to number fewer than 5,000 by November of 2020. He had hoped the next U.S. administration might even adopt the mantra of 5,000 troops for 5 years to show the commitment to the mission. While the original statement made by President Bush to overcome all terrorism seemed overwhelming and unattainable, these smaller and smarter goals would be reached within years. My dad always told me to set smart goals, goals that were specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And the U.S. could be doing just that, if they were able to follow these rules. According to the U.S. Department of State, as of January 15, 2021, the United States had approximately 2,500 troops in Afghanistan engaged in 2 missions. 1, a bilateral counterterrorism mission in cooperation with the Afghan forces, and 2, participation in RSM, or the Resolute Support Mission, which was launched by NATO to train, advise, and assist the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces in sustainably defending their country's citizens. This was done so by honing their skills in operational planning, budgetary development, force generation process, management and development of personnel, logistical sustainment, and civilian oversight. Both of these endeavors could succeed in concluding the war if given time and effort. But the most important goal for our own removal is to secure Afghan allegiance and ensure their investment in their own independence. American efforts have been valued up to this point, but we can only successfully move out of the Middle East if Afghanistan is persuaded with our vision for their freedom and our withdrawal. Imposing an American democratic system on the Afghan society may actually create more problems because the Afghans segregate themselves by divisions of religious sectors and form their own communities in correspondence to that faction. Afghan unity, however, will be necessary in order to hold the improving but ethnically unbalanced Afghan National Army together. In the absence of such a unity, no military campaign to contain or marginalize the Taliban is likely to prevail. As Major Kirk Dewey put it, quote, "Are we really helping in the Middle East if our goal is to make their country look exactly like ours? Can they ever really look like us? So instead, we can corroborate with them until they are set in the right direction so they can take ownership for their own nation's success. But that requires trust. And until now, the extensive use of airstrikes and drones to carry out offensive attacks has resulted in heavy civilian casualties, which raises suspicion and anger among many Afghans. The sight of uniformed foreigners in their land has incited resentment and distrust in Afghan people on account of a fear grounded in lack of understanding. Forgive me as I use another medical analogy. In the human body, when a disease, bacteria, or foreign substance enters the system, white blood cells are responsible for protecting the body by attacking that regarded threat. These white blood cells are like the Afghan people. But sometimes what the white blood cells perceive as foreign invaders are actually harmless, or even helpful to the body. An example of that would be allergens, an occurrence when white blood cells mistake the antigens in healthy substances to be dangerous. Even though America has sought to aid Afghanistan, the white blood cells in some people will continue to identify dangers unnecessarily, just as the Afghan people may continue to perceive the U.S. and their land as a threat, unless we communicate clearly a reassurance of our alliance with them. Antagonists will say that America must leave Afghanistan now, implying that the terrorists can be checked without a peace deal or an American military presence on the ground, even if our departure leads to an all-out civil war and or a victory by the Taliban. These opposers have no regard for the organization and foresight we will lose by waiting for terrorists to strike first. What control will be lost, what progress will be lost, what lives will be lost. This argument shows an unrealistic appreciation for the geographic remoteness and ruggedness of the Hindu Kush, as well as a poor appreciation of how counterterrorism intelligence is developed, usually by cooperation with partners on the ground. We need to be collaborated from a personal position in Afghanistan to truly appropriate and understand action against threats. Others imply that future Al-Qaeda or ISIS presence on Afghan soil could be handled with long-range strikes or occasional commando raids that emanate from ships in the Indian Ocean. While I concede that America, being the major international power, could likely withstand an attack, the proactive approach we have been taking thus far in order to prevent an opportunity for terrorists to strike first will be completely nullified. To say that terrorist groups could be handled from afar, or the even more thoughtless suggestion that such groups have no substantial future interest in basing themselves in Afghanistan, are arguments that ignore history and the essence of global extremist movements in general. Few saw the ISIS caliphate coming in Iraq and Syria before 2014, but then all of a sudden it was there. No, we must remain on the ground with intentional military forces, training the ANA, the Afghanistan National Army, together with U.S. troops to build confidence and support from the locals. In conclusion, our nation, as well as other nations around the world, are kept safe by America's proactive approach against foreign terrorism in the Middle East. As we have learned from past wars, the approach matters as much as the outcome in any war. We have a responsibility for our choices, and we must wisely regard our resources and our soldiers. If we send our military away from their families, then we must be certain that we are only engaging them with a clear goal and mission. Having seen the progress made for humanity's sake in the Middle East, I hope that you now realize that the question of whether or not to stay does have nuance, but ultimately that we should stay to support the Afghans and protect our people proactively until Afghanistan can stand on its own 2 feet against terror.